Hi AP World students, Mrs. Longnecker here again, and you can see, still have my crown because we're still talking about empires. In my previous video, I talked to you about the expansion of land empires from 1450 to 1750. And now I want to talk about some examples of how those empires ruled over those vast territories. Because one of the challenges of being a large and expansive empire is that you are conquering lands that are occupied by people who may not be like the people doing the conquering. These are people who might come from a different religious background, cultural background. They may not even speak the same language. And so how then does an empire develop a government that can administer rule over an increasingly diverse, multicultural, and multi-ethnic population? So that's the question we want to look at today. How does the administration, the actual practice of governing, work in these states? And if you remember from the previous video, as we focus on the land empires primarily, we're going to be looking at, in China, the Ming and Qing dynasties, the Mughals in South and Central Asia, the Safavids and Ottomans in the Middle East, as well as in the Americas, the Aztec and Inca states prior to their connection and conquest by the European empires, who share some of the characteristics that we're going to talk about today, but we're going to wrap around and talk about the Europeans in some future lessons. All right, there are two important tasks that a government needs to do, especially when it takes in, through generally conquest, new territories. A government needs to consolidate its power, and a government needs to legitimize its power. So let's talk through those terms really quickly. Consolidation of power is the idea of bringing together power, because previously the land that is being conquered has been ruled by maybe a few, maybe many different rulers, governments, states. And so all of the rule needs to be consolidated and really centralized to the new imperial government. And there are a couple of key strategies in this time period that are worth paying attention to. And one of these is the use of bureaucracy. We've talked about bureaucracy before. Bureaucrats are people whose jobs are the day-to-day running of government. And so bureaucracies are very important in these expansive empires because you need to hire people you can trust to do your day-to-day operations. This includes everything from collecting taxes to administering courts and the legal system. Law enforcement would be included in some forms of bureaucracy, keeping track of all of the paperwork that government generates, as all of these decisions from the government need to be spread to the people. Right? All of these are bureaucratic tasks. And these land empires had essentially a social class of elites doing a lot of these bureaucratic tasks. And along with the day-to-day operations of the government, we also see a priority given to military professionals. So professional armies, not armies of people who are just swept up from among the population, but professional soldiers who could rise through the ranks in the military to have positions of power within the government. Couple of examples that you could think about as you're thinking about this example of consolidating power. You have the devshirme system in the Ottoman Empire, in which Ottoman government officials would require the tribute. And you've probably read about tribute systems before, but it's the idea of paying to the government some portion of your wealth that is different from taxes, but that demonstrates your loyalty to the government. So Ottoman officials would come to Christian families specifically and demand a tribute of their sons. These Christian boys would then be raised in Ottoman government housing and educated, and many times would become the elite military janissary corps who fought on behalf of the government empire. But some of these janissary officials that were given as tribute through the devshirme system, would convert to Islam and actually take jobs in government after their military service was over and become then these same loyal, dedicated Ottoman officials who maybe even collected the next wave of devshirme. So this is a system that the Ottomans built into, like not just demanding loyalty, but educating and instilling loyalty in a particular population that they might have otherwise seen as a threat in their society. Japan, which despite being a series of islands, as a state functions a lot like these land empires. Japan also has a system of elites and military professionals, including some of the samurai who by the 1600s oftentimes were paid by the Japanese government. So they were salaried to continue their skills and their loyalty and their defense of Japan, both militarily, but also culturally. The samurai were really held up as like a pinnacle of Japanese culture, and threats to traditional Japanese culture and way of life were really resisted by the Japanese government in this period in particular. We talked about tribute with the devshirme system, but a second way that empires consolidated power was by collecting goods and money, either through tribute or taxes, to generate revenue for the government. So making sure that the people are paying the government what is owed, and that the government is taking in enough revenue to run its day-to-day operations, right? That brings the power. You're no longer paying taxes to your local rulers, you're paying taxes to this central imperial government, and they are the ones holding the power of the purse strings, so to speak. And so we might think of, there are some different systems, and you are likely to read about a variety of different systems, but some vocab terms that you may come across are the zamindar, who are the tax collectors of the Mughal Empire. You may encounter in your readings the Mexica or Aztec tribute system, in which outlying states whom maybe were or were not directly under centralized control of the Aztecs would pay tribute in goods or wealth to the central Aztec state. Sometimes tribute is paid by states within an empire, and sometimes it's paid by people on the fringes of an empire to say, yes, we will honor and be loyal to you. We will be your allies. Please don't come and attack us and conquer us like you may have done our neighbors. So these tribute systems remain in place in the Americas, in parts of Asia as well. Tribute is a part of this consolidation of power. And the Ming in China actually go a step further in their tax collection, not only of demanding amounts in taxes, but actually deciding on how taxes had to be paid. The Ming in particular, the Ming government decided that silver currency was the only acceptable currency for paying taxes. And I mention this here because it's going to come into play later on. Chinese people, Chinese businesses, need silver to pay their taxes. So if somebody shows up with a whole lot of silver from somewhere else, hint, hint, as we read ahead in the text, that is one good that China is going to want through trade. China wants silver. Chinese businesses, Chinese people want silver so that they can pay their taxes. China at this point is still very powerful, still one of the main manufacturing centers of the world, and for the most part, self-sufficient, or only needing to trade regionally, and goods that are being produced in places like Western Europe, for example, are not especially desirable in Chinese markets. Silver, on the other hand, going to be really important. The second big thing that empires needed to do, besides consolidating their power and bringing it together in that central government, is to legitimize their power. And that's a word that means to make your authority seem like the proper authority, right? To make it legitimate. And there are a couple of ways that empires typically did this. And one is through the use of religion. In some states, we see an expansion of religious tolerance, but in other states, we see a consolidation of control of religion by the state. The Europeans, who I haven't talked about a whole lot, but for example, in Europe, many European kings, as they consolidated their power from the decentralized feudal system of the Middle Ages, developed the idea of the divine right of kings, that God gave the king the right to rule. And so to defy the king was to defy God himself. We also see in the Songhai state in West Africa a government promotion of Islam as the state-mandated religion. And that was a way for governments to say, hey, if you defy the king, if you defy the emperor, you are defying the core beliefs of our state religion, which is a big deal for people who are deeply religious. You don't want to defy God in your practice. And if defying the king is defying God, that's a really big deal for people. So it would legitimize the power of these empires. This, by the way, is not new in world history. Remember that in China, the emperors were referred to as the sons of heaven. They have a divine connection. They have the mandate of heaven given to the government as long as they are ruling correctly and appropriately. Going way back into the ancient world, we see that most kings and emperors in places like the Mediterranean or Egypt or the Middle East connected themselves in some way to divine authority, either claiming to be anointed by the gods, sons of gods, or even gods themselves, manifestations, incarnations of the gods, like the Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be. So these religious ideas to legitimize power is a continuation of a much older political trend that was still very significant in this 1450 to 1750 era. Another way that rulers legitimized their power was to create things that showed their power to the people, which again is a continuation of a much older history of art and monumental architecture. But a couple of specific examples from this time period that are worth knowing so that if you saw them in a question, you would say, oh, I understand why that place or that piece of art is significant. You might think about the Inca Sun Temple at Cusco, built by the Inca leaders for worship of the sun god, who was said to have granted power and authority to the kings, right? So we're using a religious idea and combining it with this massive piece of architecture, this enormous temple that then shows the power of the leaders. We could also think about a particularly famous piece of architecture from the Mughals in India, the Taj Mahal, which, believe it or not, is a mausoleum. It is a structure built in honor of Aurangzeb, one of the Mughal emperor's wives. When she died, he built this beautiful mausoleum to honor her life. And these beautiful architectural wonders are a way to say to the people, look, I am so powerful as king that I can build this amazing, beautiful project. And of course, you should continue to honor me because I am demonstrating my power and my authority to you in this way. European kings built themselves not castles, which were defensive structures, but they began to build palaces. So we see the palaces of the Russian czars, we see Versailles in France, and some of these other much more ornamental and beautiful places where the kings and their royal courts would actually spend considerable amounts of time surrounded by art and beauty and reflecting then their legitimacy to the people who could see this art and this beauty surrounding their kings and say, oh, they must be legitimate authorities because how else would they have gained so much power? Now, to a 21st century audience, these strategies of legitimizing power may seem somewhat foreign to us, particularly those of us who have grown up in democratic systems where the idea of voting and representation are much more a core part of our cultural values. But at the time, these strategies were especially significant, and they're not actually dissimilar to some of the strategies that we see presidents and modern rulers using even within the United States. If we think about monumental architecture, we might think about structures that have been built to honor presidents of the past and remind us of the legitimacy of our government and our Constitution. You might think of places like Mount Rushmore, where we literally have the faces of former leaders carved in stone. You might think of the Washington Monument or the Lincoln Memorial, both of which are built to specifically remember and to honor the memory of great leaders of the past, with the hope of inspiring confidence in the leaders of the present. That's why leaders oftentimes will give speeches in front of these pieces of monumental architecture to take some of the glory from the past and hopefully have it reflect on themselves as they speak to their people today. So consolidating and legitimizing power are still strategies that governments are using today, even if the specific practical details might differ slightly from empires of the past. So as empires are administering their governments and ruling over their people, they're using different strategies to consolidate or bring together and legitimize or make reasonable the power that they hold over these people. Have a great day, AP World students. I hope that you are well, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Bye.